This is the Voice of Russia. My name is Brendan Cole. A moral outrage and a criminal act. That's the damning verdict of the United Nations chief, Ban Ki-moon, as he described the shelling of a UN-run school in Gaza. It's his strongest word since the start of the conflict and comes after Palestinian officials said at least 10 people had died in the attack on the weekend. The Israel Defense Force have confirmed that they have begun withdrawing some troops from Gaza. It said it was extremely close to completing its mission to destroy a network of tunnels. Health officials in Gaza say 1,800 Palestinians, mostly civilians, have been killed and more than 9,000 injured since the conflict began nearly 4 weeks ago. 66 Israelis, meanwhile, have died, all but 2 of them soldiers. Already, this conflict between Hamas and Israel has outlasted the 2 previous ones, but with Israel not present at talks in Cairo, what hope for an end to the violence? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Yousef al-Helou. He's a Palestinian journalist. Also here is Jonathan Sacerdoti. He's a commentator and political analyst on the Middle East. And Vijay Mehta, chair of the group Uniting for Peace. On the line, we have Dr. Atef Alshaer, who is a lecturer in Arabic Studies at the University of Westminster, and from Jerusalem, Gil Hoffman, chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. Gil Hoffman, I'd just like to start with you first. I mean, first of all, the reaction to Ban Ki-moon's comments yesterday. This is the strongest we've heard from him. Does this kind of criticism have an impact on Israel?
Look, the United Nations has been playing a role in this conflict. Their schools have been used to house missiles that were fired against Israeli civilians throughout the conflict. When missiles were found in their schools, they handed them back to Hamas that were used to be fired again. And so when Ban Ki-moon came here and condemned both sides, he was taken more seriously. When he puts out statements that condemn one side, then he gets taken less seriously. And this is an operation that Israel is doing to restore quiet, to stop civilians on both sides of the line from being harmed. And the way to stop that is to have the Hamas stop firing at Israelis and to have the rocket attacks against Israelis stop. The United Nations wants to be relevant. They need to make sure that their own facilities are not used by terrorists, and that when it comes to rebuilding the Gaza Strip, that they monitor, that the world monitors much better, that the money that goes into Gaza be used for building schools, playgrounds, and hospitals, and not for tunnels that are used to attack Israeli schools, playgrounds, and hospitals.
But, Gil, I guess the criticism among many was simply that actually the Israeli army had been provided with the coordinates of this particular building, and yet it was still fired upon.
Then Hamas needs to not fire at Israel from United Nations buildings. When Israel's fired upon, then Israel will respond to the fire. And meanwhile, continue to do everything possible to minimize civilian deaths on both sides of the line, while Hamas continues to take steps to maximize civilian deaths on both sides of the line, cynically using its own people as human shield.
Mark Regev, the Israeli spokesman, said that this was a targeted airstrike, that the school was not actually shelled as initially reported. Do we have any clarity on that?
All I know is that Israel does not target civilians, certainly not in a United Nations facility, while the Hamas purposely fires from such facilities in order to try to get Israel to fire back, in order to try to harm not only Israelis, but to try to harm their own people. And their people should say that they're sick and tired of this. The Palestinian people deserve better leadership that will not bring their people into harm's way. They have an election coming up. They should elect moderates who will lead their people to a brighter day.
Yousef, it is a strong point, isn't it? I mean, we are, perhaps in the maelstrom of media coverage in the West, we are forgetting just exactly what Hamas do. And they do have human shields. They do put missiles in hospitals.
What we've heard is, again, a justification to Israel's deliberate attacks against civilians, against sites run by the United Nations. I have heard to Mark Regev's remarks last night when he justified killing 10 people in a school in Rafah. He said that that was a targeted assassination of an Islamic Jihad member. But there is something wrong with your equipment. You killed 10 people and you keep justifying your attacks against civilian population. I mean, you've got the coordinates, and you could have waited until this suspect, is not near the school. I think what Israel is doing in Gaza, Israel wants to send Gaza back to the Stone Age. And I think the atrocities in Gaza go on due to the international conspiracy of silence.
Okay, but I mean, some of the points that Gil was raising there, certainly with this criticism from Ban Ki-moon, it was a UN senior official himself, John Ging, who said Hamas are firing their rockets into Israel from the vicinity of UN facilities and residential areas.
Well, a UN official, Chris Gunness, he said that they investigated one of the incidents in an attack that took place in Beit Hanun town, and he said that they collected evidences and a shrapnel fired by Israeli tanks, and witnesses said that there were no rocket fire from that vicinity. Of course, we have been hearing these rumors and allegations and claims that the rocket fire was fired from Gaza, and again, this is a justification.
Jonathan, should we go back to last week and the end of the 72-hour ceasefire? I mean, I say a 72-hour ceasefire, but it really only lasted about 3 or 4 hours. The disintegration of that ceasefire was blamed on Hamas, and it came a day after the White House had criticised Israel, which was quite strong. But there are question marks over just how that ceasefire was broken. The kidnapping of Hadar Goldin, Hamas was blamed, but there's questions over how he went missing and when. I mean, what do you make of that kind of information, perhaps disinformation on both sides?
I think there's a great problem with figuring out exactly what is going on when we hear claims from both sides which contradict each other. And so it's important to try as best as possible during the ongoing military campaign there in Gaza to figure out what is most likely to be happening. Of course, in due course, I'm sure we'll figure out better details and versions of exactly what happened, and the various different investigations that different people are saying they will carry out will help us in that aim. What seems to me to be happening there is that the Israelis claimed that Hamas broke the ceasefire with particularly this attack that ended up with the death of 2 soldiers and what they thought was the kidnapping of the soldier who has now been declared dead. And it's not clear whether his body has been repatriated to Israel or not, and whether, in fact, the body was somehow kept, which is something that is a technique used by Islamist terrorists in the past with Israel. They're quite happy to hold a body to ransom as well as a live soldier, though obviously a live soldier exacts a much greater price in negotiations, as we saw with the Gilad Shalit abduction. And the Gilad Shalit abduction actually is a good case in point, because that took place, as we'll all remember, through a tunnel dug under the border from Gaza into Israeli territory, and Gilad Shalit was taken from there. And I think that brings us to the central issue of one of the claims of the Israelis that we're hearing at the moment, which is that part of the aim of this particular incursion into Gaza is to get rid of these tunnels that they call the terror tunnels. They say that there's a much bigger network of them being dug now, and that those tunnels are a huge threat to Israel, because this time they're not even just burrowing underneath and slightly over the border, but well into Israeli villages and towns and kibbutzim, where there appears to have been a threat to carry out a coordinated attack sometime during the next month or two on civilians and to kidnap them or kill them. And we know exactly what the terrorists that Israel faces are capable of. When we think back to the murder of the Fogel family in the West Bank, their children's throats cut by terrorists, Palestinian terrorists. When we think about the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, these are 2 examples of exactly the kind of strategy that can be taken. So this network of tunnels is something that they can be justifiably concerned about, I think. But then we have to, of course, balance that with the method they have of trying to deal with these threats, and whether the claims of some sort of disproportionality are valid, and or whether or not their claims that they're targeting certain tunnels and certain people in a strategic way in order to minimize civilian casualties or not is a valid claim.
Okay, well, Dr. Alshaer, I mean, what would Hamas's military objectives be? I mean, Israel, it's very clear that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to see an end to these tunnels. He wants to see them destroyed. That's a tough ask. But in terms of Hamas's military objectives, what are they?
There has been such a massive sort of misrepresentation of the Palestinian position, and it's all being reduced to Hamas's threats. And I think amidst all of this is the horror that Israel has visited upon the Palestinians through killing thousands of civilians. I think this is just so unjustifiable. And this is school, it just happened that I went to this school as a child, and actually so far away from anything that could be said that Hamas is launching rockets from there. So it's just another misrepresentation that Israeli spokespersons have been very hell-bent on doing in order to justify their murderous intent, which cannot be justified. As for Hamas, I think for them it's always been a matter of survival, as indeed it's for the Palestinian people. It's been since 1982, Israel sends the same sort of message, which is wiping out any organization that attempts to resist their occupation and their aggressive attacks constantly against the Palestinian people. I think the broader context of this conflict have been forgotten and somehow trampled upon in much of the discussions that we hear in the media in the West. And I think this is the problem. The occupation is not sort of a very small thing. It's a major thing for the Palestinians. It disrupts their life. It makes it impossible to live. And Israel, according to Kerry and according to many officials, Israel was the one responsible for the collapse of what used to be called the peace process. And there was no peace process. There was just expansion of settlements, expansion of the wall and building of the wall and destruction, constant destruction to Palestinian livelihoods, including in Gaza. So I think as far as Hamas is concerned, it's that it survives as a movement, and I think it will. And the conflict obviously is asymmetrical conflict. So Israel will always going to somehow destroy more, to target more. But as far as Hamas is concerned, it's always been that it wants to come out as a movement that survives and that somehow resists this kind of very destructive and very, very distortive occupation.
Okay, well, Gil Hoffman, I suppose even allowing for Hamas's brutality in how they fire rockets upon Israel, no democracy would be that happy with a military strategy that results in the deaths of so many women and children.
Look, I can answer the question you just asked him that he didn't answer. The goal of Hamas is to kill every man, woman, and child in Israel. That's why they're firing rockets not at military bases. They're firing them at cities. They're firing them at Tel Aviv. They're firing them at our airport. And they will continue trying to attack Israel until Israel is wiped off the map. That's what their charter says. That's what their goal is. Yeah, I was there in Gaza when Israel painfully removed 10,000 Jews living there, who'd been living there for 3 generations, this week, 9 years ago, with the hope of bringing peace, with the hope of providing the people of Gaza no longer occupied, with a haven that could show the world what the Palestinian state would be. That would be a model for the withdrawal from the West Bank, which Netanyahu supports withdrawing from the overwhelming majority of the West Bank and creating 2 states for 2 peoples. And it didn't happen because the Hamas overthrew the rightful Palestinian Authority leadership in Gaza in a military coup against their people. Remember, there are a lot more Arabs killed by Arabs in this region than there are Arabs killed by Jews and Jews killed by Arabs together. And as for the peace process that there was until a few months ago, it broke down because Abbas decided to make a deal with Hamas, with the terrorists firing rockets at Israel, instead of making a deal with Israel. And the Palestinian people deserve better than the leadership that has only led them into war and pain and poverty. They can have better, and then they'll find that Israel is willing to make a deal with them that will end the conflict and make life better for both the Palestinian people and the people of Israel.
Yousef, Gil has a point there. Every time Hamas fires rockets into Israel, what is the reaction of Palestinians, moderate Palestinians, when they think, oh no, they're provoking a very disproportionate, asymmetric siege on the civilian population? What is the relationship between the moderate Palestinians and Hamas?
Let's make it clear. Gaza is still an occupied territory. Israel still maintains full control of Gaza's airspace, territorial waters, and border crossings. The Strip has been under a crippling, strangling Israeli siege for the past 7 years. Nearly 2 million people are being denied the right to freedom of movement, to export, import, to live a normal, decent life. Israel has got the most sophisticated weapons on the planet, uses disproportionate force, attacking defensively. What do you expect from an oppressed nation? For the past 65 years, the Palestinians are seeking, self-determination. They just want to have a decent life. What's happening in Gaza could be described as a genocide. And by the way,
why is it a genocide?
We haven't heard any
on the point. Genocide is a very loaded term, especially given Israel's history. Why is this a genocide? That's the eradication of a race of people. That's a very strong term to be bandying about.
This is exactly what's happening. Israel is carrying out an ethnic genocide, an ethnic cleansing.
You can describe it as collective punishment, but genocide it's not.
Well, when you practice deliberate targeting of civilians, destruction of properties, this is classified as genocide because you are practicing this against the other.
The population has risen. The Palestinian population, since the State of Israel's existence, has risen enormously. So how can you call it a genocide if you've just said they have the most sophisticated military means in the world? They could easily wipe out the Palestinian people if that were truly their aim. Of course, the word genocide is an extremely loaded term, as you said, Brendan. I think it's totally unjust to throw that at a nation that is born largely out of of people who suffered the worst attempted genocide against the Jewish people. And that's the real reason why people use that term, is to try and hold against Jews the crime that the world did not protect them from. But there's no attempted genocide of Palestinians. That's clear to anyone looking at the cold hard facts.
How can you describe the deliberate destruction of homes against
Well, again, your use of the word deliberate there is again very loaded.
It is deliberate. Yes, it is deliberate.
Well, it's debatable whether it's deliberate. That's the whole point here. Israel says that it doesn't deliberately target civilians. You say that it does, and that's the argument.
Something wrong with their equipment.
But there's something wrong with their equipment? Yes. What are you talking about?
I mean, I'm talking about Israel has got the most sophisticated weapons. And
so if it wanted to wipe out the Palestinian race, as you've just said, it would do so in a bat of an eyelid if it has the most sophisticated military weapons. Your accusation of genocide is ludicrous.
Okay, on the point, moving away from the genocide point, what I'd really like to know, Yousef, what about moderate Palestinians when a Hamas rocket attack happens? How do they feel? Because there's not really a lot of places to hide, and they know that this will provoke an Israeli response. What's the relationship between those Hamas militants and moderate Palestinians?
Well, as a matter of fact, not all people in Gaza are Hamas supporters. Now, the reason why people are supporting the resistance right now, because Israel does not differentiate between resistance targets or civilian targets. Now, of course, people, they want to see an end to these hostilities. They want to have a normal life, an end to the siege, the opening of the all-border commercial crossings. We must have our own airport and seaport. If Israel claims it has withdrew its forces, Israel must not, object this basic right. So people, they, of course, they say that Israel does not need any justification actually to carry out an attack against Gaza. And let's just remember, this war started in the West Bank. Israel kept changing its stated goal, saying that, Hamas was responsible. Hamas denied a responsibility to the kidnapping or the disappearance of 3 settlers. And then when it invaded Gaza, said that we are after the tunnels. And now they are, they want to put an end to the rocket fire. And now they say, well, we're after those guys, bad guys who kidnapped our soldier. So what's happening is a justification after pretext, and the world is watching. People are being killed. I've lost 15 members from my family. My house was deliberately attacked. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. How can the world allow this to happen?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the Gaza conflict. With me in the studio is Jonathan Sacerdoti, the commentator and analyst, Vijay Mehta, chair of the group Uniting for Peace, and Yousef al-Helou, a Palestinian journalist. On the line, we have Atef Alshaer, who is a lecturer in Arabic Studies at the University of Westminster, and Gil Hoffman, chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. And on that point about an international response, Vijay, I'll turn to you. There was criticism, as I said, from the White House and, of course, from Ban Ki-moon over the weekend. But Ed Miliband, the Labour Party leader, said that David Cameron's silence is inexplicable. Do you think that the British response has been quiet on this?
Yeah, absolutely mute. Don't know if people know it or not. Behind the scenes, Britain has been supplying weapons to Israel. And so has US. US has been supplying weapons to every year to the tune of 3 to 5 billion US dollars. So it doesn't help if you on one side supply weapons and on other side sending your Secretary of State John Kerry for going around and trying to broker peace. You've got to be an honest broker if you want to have. Here, the situation has gone the longest, over 3 weeks, and 2,000 people have been killed. And of course, 40 to 50 Israelis have been killed as well. Now,
over 60.
Over 60. Mm-hmm. The grievances are on both sides, yeah? But the point is, we do not wish or want, from an international community's point of view, we do not wish or want this conflict to escalate and become a conflict like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all that. So the peace has to be brokered right now. Otherwise, it will be like a big protected war which will carry on, and the domination, I'm afraid, of the Israelis over Palestinians will continue.
But Gil Hoffman, very interested in your view on, there have been quite considerable anti-Israeli protests over the course of last week through European capitals and so on. Do Israelis feel that the world is against them?
The answer is no. Israelis fear for Europe. Israelis fear that the Europeans need to wake up. The same Islamic fundamentalism that attacked Israel through tunnels and through rockets in this war attacked Britain on July 7th, 2005. Has attacked Spain. They're getting more and more power in Europe as their numbers grow. And if they don't realize yet what kind of threat they're under, they'll unfortunately find out the hard way. And so, if anything, when we see these demonstrations, we fear for the Jews living in these European countries, and we fear for the Western way of life that's under threat right now in Europe. I'm not afraid here in Jerusalem, even though there have been 2 terrorist attacks in Jerusalem over the last 3 hours. A man went into a tractor and started ramming it at a bus and trampled an Israeli civilian at the time. And also another Palestinian opened fire at an Israeli soldier just in the tunnel on a road. But I am not afraid here in Jerusalem. I'd be afraid if I was in London right now.
There is this humanitarian window, however long this holds, we don't know. But the news that the Israeli army has redeployed some of its troops along the Gaza border, do you think this suggests that it's trying to wind the military operation down unilaterally without talks, without an agreed ceasefire with Hamas?
I suspect that the Israeli intention is to set the agenda itself. So rather than be forced into talking indirectly with Hamas about a ceasefire which would see terms that they know can't be kept and won't be kept by Hamas, and requirements by Hamas that also can't be met, such as the total opening of all borders, which of course would lead to the mass importation of materials to build more tunnels for the use of terror purposes and the import of weapons, because those things have happened even with the limitations on crossings at the border, whereas food and humanitarian goods have been allowed over the border, and plenty of other goods beside which have no dual purpose. So I do think that there is something in what you say that maybe Israel is trying to set the agenda and make sure that any ceasefire will be on its terms, and its surest way of doing that is to do that unilaterally. And what I think is important in that respect is to, again, what we've got to try and do to pick apart these words and accusations and narratives on both sides is try and decide as analysts whether this is reasonable and whether these ideas are fair. I think that the main problem in much of the discussion of this is that there's this concept that we're dealing with 2 equal sides who have equal demands. I mean, I saw a cartoon in the newspaper a couple of days ago with a picture of, a Hamas man on one side and Benjamin Netanyahu on the other, and John Kerry in the middle with a piece of paper that said Hamas demands the death of all Jews, and John Kerry looking to Benjamin Netanyahu and saying, now, can't we meet them halfway? And I think that's the Israeli perspective. What are they meant to do when the Hamas charter mentions 12 times the killing of Jews, when it mentions in Article 7 that genocide, if we're going to talk about genocide, that's a genocidal document in its intent. It specifies that it wants the wiping out of Israel and Jewish people. So I think the idea that we're dealing with 2 equal sides that can sit around a table directly or indirectly and negotiate their way out of this is somewhat ridiculous. What we're actually dealing with is what's happening across the world, especially across the Middle East. It's a jihadi force which will go to extreme lengths to kill Westerners. The Westerners nearest this particular jihadi force are Israelis, who stand up for and represent similar values to Britain, Europe and America. And that's why Britain, Europe and America and the leadership of those countries, whilst expressing a lot of concern about these tragic civilian deaths, are actually behind Israel's actions here, as is most of the Middle East. This is the first time that Hamas has found itself quite so isolated, because actually, quietly, in a rather strange alliance of Middle Eastern countries and Israel, most of the Middle East would also like to see Hamas crushed here, and they recognize an opportunity for that, and all the better if they can let Israel do the dirty work.
Dr. Alshaer, I suppose Egypt wants to see the end of Hamas, doesn't it? And the last ceasefire was brokered in 2012 when Mohamed Morsi was in power. He's in jail now. Egypt is key to any kind of deal.
Yes, Egypt is key to any kind of deal. I don't think that Egypt is that naive to expect the end of Hamas, or to expect that Hamas will be crushed that easily. After all, we're speaking about Palestinian people who are under occupation, which has been absent from this discourse. This Israeli spokesperson, the gentleman in Jerusalem, is trying to somehow point to the Palestinians who should elect as leaders, as if there are no right wing in Israel. Speaking incredibly about London, have to be afraid. In fact, I'm sitting in the heart of London, no problem. So, I mean, the kind of lumping discourse that is being used in order to reduce the Palestinian people and their demands to Hamas, which I don't agree with all its policies and all its ideology as such, but at the same time I understand its context, and I disagree with some and agree with others. But the point is to say that I don't think Egypt is that naive to expect the end of Hamas. nor anybody in the region. I think Egypt is trying to contain the situation. Egypt obviously is hostile, doesn't like Hamas as such. That is true. That is very well known. But I think ultimately it will come down to the negotiation table. And unfortunately, all those skills was just pointless from Israel to launch such an operation and to make such costly demands on the civilian people and to destroy their infrastructure and then to ask them to build them again. I mean, and then in a few years' time, obviously, Israel will come down and tear them apart again and claim that there's no occupation in Gaza. I mean, this is just so incredible. Really so incredible what we are hearing here.
Yousef, though, ceasefires need mediators. Who's going to do the job?
Well, I think it needs real intentions from those mediators. Egypt cannot be an honest mediator when it keeps the Rafah crossing closed. This is what people say. And also the U.S. administration. The U.S. has rushed to the rescue of Israel by resupplying ammunitions, by giving Israel a green light, saying that Israel has got the right to defend itself. The U.S., the UN has failed the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza have been living through hell under occupation. The root of the problem is the occupation of the Palestinian territories. Israel still maintains the occupation over Gaza. Israel has created Hamas in the first place in order to get rid of the PLO. So these are the roots of the problem. And let's not just only focus about the rocket fire. The vast majority in Gaza are not affiliated to Hamas. The people, they say that life is meaningless under the ongoing Israeli siege. This impunity must end.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the Gaza conflict. With me is Yousef al-Helou, Jonathan Sacerdoti, Vijay Mehta, Atef Alshaer and Gil Hoffman. Vijay, leaders will have to glide away from some of the rhetoric that they've been throwing around. Do you think either side is ready for that?
I think they are, because enough is enough, and sooner or later they have to realize there are no military solutions. And while I was coming in the taxi down here, my cab driver reminded me that in Quran in 1400, they said Palestinians and Jews are going to live together. So it was predicted 1400 in 1400. So if that is the case, the reality is there is no military solutions. So there is no other way except to talk with each other. And there can't be a better day than today or yesterday to remind us how Germany and France were fighting with each other. They always were fighting. They had 30-year war, 100-year war. They were always fighting against each other. But they put their hatred aside and they are friends. They work together from the economic growth of Europe and their countries. And if there are differences, there will always be differences between countries, but they are sorting it out in the European Parliament. They are not sorting it out on the battlefield.
Gil Hoffman, I mean, Israel's declared aim is to stop rocket fire from Gaza once and for all, to destroy the tunnels. Is there confidence that they can do that?
The tunnels are nearly destroyed. Unfortunately, they found a few more, and they're still targeting the rocket launchers and targeting the terrorists themselves, who order their people to fire them and to house them in the homes of ordinary civilians. But I share with Vijay a hope for peace. The root of the problem is the Palestinians and Hamas not giving up their hope of destroying all of Israel. There's a reason why he called 3 people living inside pre-67 Israel settlers. It's all of Israel that they're trying to destroy, not just the West Bank and not just Gaza that we withdrew every Jew from. But there is hope, especially because of what Jonathan said, that with the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Palestinian Authority itself, Abbas, all recognizing that Hamas needs to end its hold over Gaza, that they took illegitimately, and return Gaza to the Palestinian people, that could lead to negotiations with Israel that could end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, taking a regional approach that Egypt and Saudi Arabia can take part in for the betterment of the lives of the Palestinians and of Israel. There's hope.
So negotiations, Jonathan, towards a two-state solution?
Well, that's everybody's dream here, I think.
Is it really, though?
Well, I think anybody reasonable who's looking at this situation. And I think something that Yousef said actually a moment ago is really the crux of the problem here, and Gil has just echoed it there. It's the failure of the leadership of the Palestinian people that I think repeatedly gets them into this sort of loop. It is true that Hamas won its election and then in a coup killed a lot of Fatah opposition in Gaza and has such since ruled over the Strip without democratic mandate anymore, certainly. So one can hope that in the upcoming elections that are promised, though those have been promised many times, there will be a more moderate and realistic leadership for them. And Yousef said the UN has failed the people of Gaza. I wholeheartedly agree. The UN has, rather unusually, an entire agency set up just for looking after Palestinian refugees. Every other refugee population in the world is looked after by one agency, and UNRWA looks after Palestinian refugees. And yet, over the course of this engagement in Gaza, something fascinating has come to light that many knew about before, but now it's become sort of popular opinion, and people have seen it with their own eyes, that UNRWA has admitted 3 schools housing terrorist rockets, and then Israeli soldiers were blown up in a booby-trapped UNRWA medical clinic. These are quite important things to look at for the Palestinian people. The very agency that's set up uniquely to look after them is housing weapons, and apparently, according to the Israelis, and footage that they have released, declassified footage from their drones and the like, is also allowing Hamas fighters and jihadi fighters to fire from within or around those UN facilities. Now, the UN is letting down the Palestinians enormously to that end and is not working towards a two-state solution when it's effectively turning a blind eye, at the very kindest possible interpretation, to these sorts of terror activities from within UN facilities. That's ludicrous letting down of the Palestinian people, who deserve a lot better than that if they are to fulfill their hope of a peaceful coexistence alongside a state of Israel.
Can I get your response to that, Yousef?
Well, there is no rocket fire from the West Bank, and yet Israel continues its military attacks in the West Bank. The peace process has not bear fruit for the past 21 years. Israel's main goal from this offensive on Gaza is to sabotage the Palestinian national unity. And if the US, the UN, they are really want to solve this issue, then they should not be take side against the other side. The people of the Palestinians, the people of Gaza, they have had enough. They want to have a decent life. They want to move freely. They want to have their own airport, seaport, to fish freely, farm freely without any intimidation. And as a Palestinian, I can tell you that we are pessimistic. We do not believe. I mean, we believe that Israel is not honest, is not interested in peace.
Dr. Alshaer, can I just ask you, though, in terms of any kind of ceasefire deal, and we talked about Egypt's role in this, the Arab League Secretary General actually made the point he believes that Hamas will agree to the Egyptian proposal, but they also want a few extras. One of the key demands, of course, the opening of Gaza's borders. That's the major sticking point, isn't it, initially, prior to any kind of talks to a two-state solution?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the main point. I mean, Hamas actually, all the Palestinian factions, not only Hamas, have 10 demands. And I think all of them are actually reasonable. They call for the end of the blockade that has been going on for many years, and that have crippled Palestinian life. And basically, it's the major issue, the sticking point in Gaza, the blockade, and it's effects on people's lives. And also the fact that Israel has now gone into Gaza Strip. So until these troops have also withdrawn again, how could you somehow a ceasefire to last? It's not going to last. So the issues, the outstanding issues that were before this offensive slaughter in Gaza, Israeli offensive slaughter in Gaza have started, before this, issues remain, and unfortunately these can only breed further violence, which is very unfortunate, obviously. But I think that the structure that exists, I think Israel, if it does want peace, I think it deserves a much more far-sighted leaders who will see that it cannot only survive by military might and power. This can never work on the long term. It has to coexist with the people, make peace with people that it doesn't like. If it doesn't like Hamas, it has to find a way of talking all the parties in the region. It just cannot exclude themselves and just keep calling terrorists and jihadists and connecting Europe with Israel and Palestine. I mean, it's a broad and very sweeping discourse and very distortive. It doesn't represent the reality, and it doesn't serve anyone. So the Palestinians demand, which are just demands of the end of the occupation, the end of the blockade, of this destruction, allowing them to have their livelihoods back, allowing them to prosper. And Israel, when it disengaged in 2005, it didn't allow them that. It's a lie to say that it did. It still maintained the siege. It kept the airspace. It controlled the airspace, the sea, all these kind of things that were controlled. And basic amenities and things were not allowed to go into Gaza. So there's a very hitting siege around Gaza that does breed violence and desperation, and this is incredibly unfortunate for all the people concerned. Nobody likes violence. But it's just we have to very deeply into the context and see what the root causes of it, and then speak more mindedly rather than ideologically about how to solve this very tragic and very sad conflict.
Gil Hoffman, Israel's winning the battle, but it's struggling in the war for world opinion. Is this important? How will this play out?
What's going to be happening is the war is going to end. And then there's going to be a question of what the fate of the Gaza Strip will be. Both Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Egypt and America, they would all like to see Abbas take over Gaza again, or whoever wins that Palestinian election later on. And they want to see Gaza rebuilt, but make sure that this time the world doesn't fail the Palestinian people again by allowing the money that they transfer to be used for terror instead of being used to build up Gaza. And so the question is, who's going to monitor that money? Right now, it's Israel that's helping the people in Gaza more than anyone. And the news doesn't get out that the IDF transferred 186 truckloads of goods to Palestinians in Gaza yesterday, on a day when Hamas fired 95 rockets at Israel, attempting to kill civilians. Now, so if Abbas is in charge, then hopefully it won't be Israel providing those truckloads. It will be the Palestinian people that have whatever they need. And then the international community can work with that Palestinian Authority leadership the way they have not been able to work with Hamas, because Hamas unfortunately diverts their money to terror instead of to helping their people.
Okay, well, look, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. That's Gil Hoffman, Chief Political Correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, on the line there. Also on the line, Dr. Atef Alshaer, who is a lecturer in Arabic Studies at the University of Westminster. Here in the studio, Vijay Mehta, Chair of Uniting for Peace. Also Jonathan Sacerdoti, an analyst and political commentator on the Middle East. And Yousef al-Helou, Palestinian journalist. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.